Lately, I've noticed Hollywood leaning more and more into rehashes of old intellectual properties. It's just about every movie at this point. And even for the films that look to be genuinely new and interesting concepts, there's always someone to point out that it is actually an uninspired and uncredited remake of something that came out decades ago. And while that may be the case, does it matter? Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and before I get into the merits of remakes and whether they should or shouldn't exist, I want to talk about how Hollywood is obsessed with revising and retooling the same concepts over and over again. Of course, when bringing up this topic, there's one thing that must be considered before questioning anything else. Because if you look back to the early days of what is now known as Hollywood, even then, nothing was original. There have been and will be plenty of examples that may prove me wrong, yet as I mentioned before, someone in the comments is going to actually me and show how every single film can be considered an iteration of something before it. I always like to go back to this one line from Inception because, like a lot of Nolan's writing, it highlights an incredibly wide variety of ideas when it comes to filmmaking or just life in general. And that line goes like this: the subject's mind can always trace the genesis of an idea. They might have been talking about putting an idea inside someone's head and not making a piece of art, but the point still stands. And to paraphrase, every idea can be traced back to an origin. Because no matter how original or inspired the concept and narrative of a movie is, that idea will inevitably have been done before, despite how unintentional that may be, simply because of how many stories exist. And when I say that, I'm only considering the written stories that we know of. I can only assume how many other fictional tales have been told in our history. Presumably, every subsection of every specific genre has already been played out, featuring a billion different narratives with the same story. And that's just the reality of storytelling. And that brings me to the why of it all. Why can't all of these movie studios just make something new? First off, for the exact reason I just got into, I don't think that's possible. Recently, we got Challengers, which can be considered an original idea, but even that can be traced back to 100 other films that clearly inspired it. So is Challengers an original idea? I don't think so, just because of how iterative it is over other works. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. And secondly, even if it was in a studio's power to achieve the impossible and create something new for every release of a movie, they would only go for that if there was money in it. And there's not. At least the way that studios see it, the only movies that actually make any kind of profit are those that are part of a franchise. Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, James Bond, Planet of the Apes, Mission Impossible, Pirates of the Caribbean, Fast and Furious, and Indiana Jones are all properties that were on top of the world at one point, but have all slowly diminished despite pretty much each and every one of those trying desperately to stay in the spotlight. And yet, those are all the movies that people go to see. Disney has claimed to be moving forward from newer stories, instead deciding to greenlight projects like Moana 2 and Toy Story 5, and maybe those will be good, but it's hard to get excited about them when money was the only thing motivating the decision to make them. Well-written indie dramas may be critical hits, but general audiences don't go to see them. And this is where a lot of gray area comes into the discussion, because obviously I would rather experience new stories whether they're indie or not, but so long as all of these franchises aren't entirely rebooted every 5 years like what's happened with Spider-Man and Batman, I'm fine with them continuing. Hopefully they don't bury small-time filmmakers, but personally, I'd love to see Marvel and DC movies being made until the day I die. That may be because I'm a diehard superhero fan, but I still want to see all of those continued franchises work well, because even the worst of them can be great so long as it's in the right hands. One of the most successful remakes ever made is something so good that it eclipsed the original. Because if you didn't know, 1982's The Thing is a remake of a movie from 1951. And the reason why no one ever considers that movie to be a remake or a reboot is because the filmmakers were clearly motivated to make it, and it stands on its own without ever having to be compared to the original. And not just that, The Departed, Heat, and Scarface are all remakes too. Not every remake or rehash can possibly be that good, but that's the standard that I'm looking for. Every time I hear about a new reboot, I just can't discount it until I've actually seen it, simply because written well enough, anything can be good. But before I wrap up, I want to leave you with one last anecdote, because decades ago, Hollywood was making what people called too many westerns and too many gangster movies. Everyone was convinced that the bubble would burst, and while it did, it was more of a whimper than an actual burst. Sure, they're not as popular anymore, but once in a while we still get them. And by hiring talented writers and filmmakers to make them, these movies can continuously iterate on themselves, keeping things from getting stale. Because at the end of the day, that's how Hollywood is going to keep its audience entertained. It may be near impossible to make genuinely new stories nowadays, but so long as new people with new experiences are there to tell these similar stories, I'm fine with it. So as long as the writers and filmmakers have something to say, and as long as they are retelling the same story for a specific reason, I'm happy to watch most of the remakes and reboots Hollywood can throw at me. Though for about 90% of these reboots, that isn't the case. But what do you think of remakes? Do you enjoy them? Are they the bane of your existence? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.